It's March 31st, 1776. While the Continental Congress debates independence in Philadelphia, a woman sits by candlelight in her Massachusetts farmhouse, quill in hand. Outside, the sounds of a revolution echo through the night. But inside, Abigail Adams is writing words that would challenge not just the British crown, but the very men fighting for freedom. Remember the ladies. She writes to her husband John, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. This wasn't just a wife's gentle suggestion. This was a revolutionary throwing down the gauntlet to the revolutionaries themselves. Tonight, we uncover the story of the woman who dared to expand the meaning of American liberty and the extraordinary partnership that made it possible. In the years before the American Revolution, daily life in the colonies was full of strict expectations, especially for women. From the outside, it might have looked peaceful, tidy homes, children well behaved, women managing the household while the men made decisions about land, politics, and war. But underneath that calm surface was a structure that left women with almost no voice in public life. And it wasn't by accident. The rules were built to be that way. Legally, most married women had little to no rights. Under a rule called feme covert, a woman's identity was considered covered by her husband. That meant she couldn't own property, sign contracts, or even keep the wages she earned. Once she said, "I do," her legal self pretty much disappeared. Her husband made the decisions, whether about money, land, or even what happened to their children. If a woman wasn't married, she had a few more options. But even then, she was still seen as someone who should stay quiet and obedient. And yet, these same men who benefited from this system were beginning to speak out loudly about their own lack of freedom, taxes, tyranny, a king who ruled from across the ocean. They were angry about laws made without their consent. They wanted representation, freedom, and control over their own lives. They called it tyranny when someone else claimed power over them without permission. But for women, that kind of control wasn't new. It was their everyday life. As protests against the British grew louder, the ideas behind the revolution started to spread. Words like liberty and equality filled the streets, the newspapers, and even sermons in churches. It was an exciting time, dangerous, uncertain, and full of change. But here's the problem. Those words didn't seem to include women. No one was asking what liberty meant for wives, daughters, or mothers. No one was wondering whether women should also be free to speak, to vote, or to make choices for themselves. And still, women were right there organizing boycotts, spinning cloth, running farms while their husbands went to war. They were the ones holding families together when everything around them was falling apart. They weren't just watching the revolution happen. They were keeping it going behind the scenes. This is the world Abigail Adams lived in. A world where the promise of freedom was all around her, but still out of reach for half the population. She could see the cracks in the system. She could feel how unfair it was. And while her husband, John Adams, helped build the foundation of a new nation, Abigail wasn't content to stand by silently. She had something to say, and she said it, clearly, firmly, and in a letter that would echo through American history. But before we get to that letter and why it still matters today, we need to understand what she was really pushing against. Because when Abigail Adams wrote, "Remember the ladies," it wasn't just a polite suggestion. It was a warning and a challenge. Long before Abigail Adams became the woman who would challenge the conscience of a revolution, she was just Abigail Smith, a curious, determined girl growing up in Weymouth, Massachusetts. She was born in 1770, into a family that was comfortable but not wealthy. Her father was a Congregationalist minister, and her mother came from a line of respected families. From a young age, Abigail showed a deep interest in books, ideas, and conversation, which was unusual for girls at the time. In colonial New England, boys were expected to learn Latin, study at school, and maybe even attend Harvard if they had the means. Girls, on the other hand, were taught to sew, read the Bible, and manage a household. That was it. Education for girls wasn't a priority. In many households, it wasn't even an option. But Abigail was lucky in one important way. She had access to a large family library, and her parents encouraged reading. While she didn't go to formal school, she read everything she could get her hands on. History, philosophy, poetry, political theory, these weren't just decorations on the shelf. They were her teachers. Over time, this habit of reading, thinking, and questioning shaped how she viewed the world. She may not have had a classroom, but she had a mind that refused to stay quiet. By the time she met John Adams, a young and ambitious lawyer from Braintree, she was just 17 but sharp, witted and strong-minded. John was immediately taken by her intellect and her character. She wasn't just charming, she could hold her own in letters and in conversation. They wrote to each other often, and even early on, you can sense that she was not going to be a silent partner in his life. She asked questions, she pushed him to think deeper, and in return, he respected her ideas, which wasn't common for that era. They married in 1764. She was 19, he was 28. Together, they built a home and a family. Life wasn't easy. John's work kept him away often, and Abigail was left to manage the house, the land, the children, and the worries of war and uncertainty, all while the colonies inched closer to conflict with Britain. But even during those long stretches apart, their connection stayed strong. They wrote constantly. Their letters were more than personal updates. They were filled with opinions on government, rights, morality, and leadership. She wasn't just telling him how the crops were doing or when the children had fevers. She was telling him how people were thinking, how women were working, and how freedom should mean more than just independence from a king. Abigail didn't set out to be a political voice. She became one because she paid attention. She noticed the gap between what the revolution promised and what women actually received. And thanks to years of self-study, constant reflection, and a partner who valued her thoughts, she found her voice not as a bystander, but as someone who had something to say about what liberty truly meant. By the spring of 1776, things in the American colonies were reaching a boiling point. John Adams was away in Philadelphia, deep in the debates of the Continental Congress. He was helping shape the future of a country that didn't quite exist yet. While he was surrounded by the likes of Jefferson and Franklin, back at home in Massachusetts, Abigail Adams was holding down the fort, caring for their children, managing their farm, watching troops march past, and thinking deeply about what all this talk of liberty actually meant. It was during this time, on March 31, 1776, that she wrote a letter to John I that has become one of the most powerful and bold pieces of writing by any woman during the Revolution. She didn't waste time with small talk. She got right to the point. "I desire you would remember the ladies," she wrote. At first glance, it might sound like a gentle reminder, but it wasn't. It was sharp. It was deliberate, and it was brave. Abigail was telling John, and through him, the entire founding generation, that the fight for liberty shouldn't stop at men. If this new government, built on ideas of fairness and consent, didn't include women, then it was repeating the same kind of tyranny it claimed to fight against. She didn't write in vague ideas. She laid it out plainly. She said, "If women continued to be ignored, we are determined to foment a rebellion." That wasn't a joke. That was a warning. This wasn't just about women wanting kind treatment. Abigail was calling out the very core of the revolution's promise. She was asking, if government gets its power from the consent of the governed, what happens when half the population never gave that consent? If liberty matters, why doesn't it apply to mothers, wives, daughters? And here's what makes the letter truly powerful. It wasn't written for a crowd. It wasn't for attention or applause. It was private, a wife writing to her husband, but in that quiet, personal space, she said something that no one else dared to say so directly. She also made it clear that women weren't helpless. If pushed too far, she wrote, they would become more determined and more rebellious. In other words, don't assume women will stay quiet forever. They understand injustice, they live it every day, and if the new nation wasn't going to include them, they might just make their own revolution. For Abigail, the pen was her weapon. She couldn't vote. She couldn't write laws, but she could think, she could speak. And through this letter, she held a mirror up to the leaders of the revolution, including her own husband, and asked them to live up to the very ideals they were fighting for. This wasn't a one-time complaint. It was a demand for consistency. If liberty was worth dying for, then it was also worth sharing. All of it. Abigail Adams is often remembered for one letter, the famous Remember the Lady's message she sent her husband during the birth of the American Republic. But the truth is, her advocacy didn't begin and end with a single letter. It was a lifelong pattern. She spent decades using her voice and her pen to shape the world around her, even if her name wasn't printed in newspapers or official documents. One of her closest allies in that effort was Mercy Otis Warren, a political writer and thinker in her own right. The two women wrote often, and when you read their letters, you see that they weren't just talking about household duties or the weather. They were discussing the moral direction of the new nation. Abigail didn't hold back. She shared her views on education, on power, on the need for a republic to reflect the values it claimed to represent. Mercy responded with the same boldness. Together, they formed a kind of intellectual sisterhood, exchanging ideas, encouraging each other, and proving that women could think politically just as sharply as men. One of the causes Abigail cared deeply about was education for girls. In her mind, if a republic was built on the idea that citizens should think for themselves and make informed choices, then women needed just as much learning as men. After all, women were the ones raising the next generation. If they were left in the dark, how could they be expected to raise citizens who were ready to shape a democracy? Abigail didn't just say this once and forget it. She repeated it over the years in letters, in conversations, and in the way she raised her own children. But her values didn't stop at gender. Abigail also spoke out against slavery. She saw it as completely against the ideals of liberty and equality that the revolution was supposed to stand for. In one case, when a neighbor asked if he could lodge a black boy in her home while he traveled, she refused not because of the boy, but because she knew he was enslaved. She believed no person had the right to own another, and she didn't want her household to support that system, even indirectly. That might seem like a small act now, but at the time it was bold and costly, especially in a society that preferred to stay quiet about the issue. She also stood up economically, especially when John was away for years at a time serving in the Continental Congress and later as ambassador. With no husband at home, Abigail ran their farm, oversaw workers, negotiated prices, and made sure her family stayed afloat. She didn't have the legal title to much of it, but she made the decisions. She was effectively a businesswoman, managing property and finances while raising their children in a world constantly reshaped by war and politics. And she did it all without public credit. Abigail Adams may not have spoken from a podium or sat in a chamber drafting laws, but her influence was everywhere in her letters, in her values, in the way she lived her life. Her advocacy didn't come in loud speeches. It came in daily actions, thoughtful arguments, and an unwavering belief that liberty meant more than just independence from a king. It meant justice, it meant fairness. And it had to include everyone, or it meant nothing at all. Abigail Adams didn't live to see women win the right to vote. She didn't get to see equal rights guaranteed by law or women standing in Congress. But what she did do was plant a seed, one that would grow slowly, often quietly, but with deep roots. Her words, her letters, her beliefs, they stayed behind, waiting to be picked up by the next generation. The women who led the early push for suffrage people, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and Susan B. Anthony, all worked decades later. But they looked back at women like Abigail as proof that the desire for equality had always been part of the American story, even if it hadn't been included in its first draft. They quoted her, they taught her words. That line, "Remember the ladies," became more than a phrase. It became a challenge that echoed across generations. Abigail didn't start a movement. She didn't lead marches or sign declarations, but she named something that was wrong, clearly and early. She saw how freedom was being divided up, offered to some, and withheld from others, and she refused to stay silent about it. And by putting her thoughts in writing, she gave future women a foundation to stand on. Her legacy was not just in what she said, but in how she lived, reading deeply, speaking plainly, pushing back when it mattered most. And if we're being honest, what she wrote in 1776 still hasn't lost its relevance. When she warned that women would become fomentors of rebellion, if they continued to be ignored, she wasn't just talking about politics, she was talking about respect, about being heard, about being seen. That message still resonates today in conversations about equal pay, education, healthcare, and representation. The shape of the issues may have changed, but the heart of them hasn't. There's also something deeply modern in how Abigail thought about power. She believed that a government should listen to the people, it governs all the people. That freedom isn't something to be handed out like a gift. It's something people are born with, and anything less is injustice. That's not just a historical idea, that's a living one. She also reminds us that influence doesn't always come from titles or public platforms. Sometimes it comes from letters, from questions asked at the right time, from someone refusing to look away. Abigail Adams didn't wait for permission to speak up, she just did. And that, in many ways, is the most revolutionary act of all. So the next time we talk about the founding of America, let's not treat Abigail Adams as a side note. Let's remember her for what she was: a thinker, a moral voice, and someone who knew that real liberty has to include everyone, not just in theory, but in practice. And now, let me ask you this. If Abigail could speak to us today, what do you think she'd ask us to remember? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like if you believe liberty still needs advocates. And don't forget to subscribe to Liberty Unfolded for more stories like this, voices from history that still speak to the present.